So we recall that the presidency was set up to be a limited term of 4 years, although originally there was not a term limit. In theory, the Constitution would have been originally set up to where you could serve as many terms as you wanted. But remember, George Washington set a great example by stepping down willingly after, or I should say, after his second term, willingly not seeking a third term. And that set a precedent. That president set a precedent. How do you like that? That all following presidents would follow, except for President Franklin Roosevelt. Say that 10 times real fast. Which reminds me, can anybody say toy boat 10 times real fast? Someone give it a try. Toy boat. 10 times real fast.
You got this, Lacey.
Toy boat, toy boat. I can't. I'm gonna
Toy boat,
toy boat, toy boat.
No, 3 times the time.
Toy boat, toy boat. Ugh, why is that so hard?
Try just 5 times.
Toy boat, toy boat,
Oh.
toy boat, toy
Fast,
boat.
fast.
No.
Be fast.
Job's doing it. You do it, Job.
No.
Let me hear.
Toy boat, toy boat. I can't.
Everybody
It's
do it
just
fast.
Two boat.
toy boat,
Two
toy boat.
dudes.
Hannah, you do it. 5 times.
5? I thought it was 3.
Toy boat, two. No, it's 5.
Toy boat, toy boat, toy boat.
Why would the only
toy
ones
boat,
trying
Toy
this?
boat, toy
Yeah,
boat.
why won't the-
Yeah, why aren't y'all trying?
Where's the
Yeah, one
Muldrow
job and Heber is
representation?
being entertained.
They're just not as
Where's
cool
the
as us,
Heavener
though.
Personally, I
representation?
think the
I didn't
birthday
even know
boy
Heavener was
should
a
try.
school.
Yes.
Okay, we'll have Muldrow try in about 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Okay, but anyway. With Washington to Monroe, that would be our first 6 presidents, I believe. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Adams the second. You see, George Bush and Little George were not the first father-son presidential duo, but John Adams and John Quincy Adams were the first father-son duo. So Washington, Adams, the dad, Jefferson, Madison, John Quincy Adams, and then Monroe. So the first 6 presidents, the presidency really didn't evolve. That was more of a time where the legitimacy of the presidency was kind of secured, that it was going to be, it was not going to turn into a monarch, right? Because our founders did not want a strong executive who would become like King George. So those first 6 presidents served with a level of respect. Even though we had established a new country, there was still that kind of thinking that only the elite of society should serve as representatives, because the elite upper class citizens will do what is right for the whole country. The lower class citizens would, they wouldn't know how to govern and represent everybody. So the first 6 men were men of distinction, well respected, took the office very seriously, didn't want to abuse their office, but wanted to serve modestly in the use of their powers. They were also men that had been involved in the period from 1776 to 1787, the independence period. So, and also a fun fact, these 6 presidents were either from Virginia or Massachusetts. Those were the 2 states that the first 6 presidents came from. So those of you, I think it's Job and Hannah, if I remember correctly, you all have Andrew Jackson in the assignment. So when we get to Andrew Jackson, the 7th president, we're going to have one who's going to come in and really affect the presidency so that it begins to evolve and expand. He introduces what's called the spoils system. It comes from the saying, to the victor goes the spoils. And so spoils being the treasure, the money, the booty, whatever you want to call it. The victor gets all the treasures and the goods, the spoils. And so what that meant was Jackson became the chief executive, the president, and he had now the authority to appoint the people that he wanted in positions. And he did that. He appointed close friends and family to positions of leadership, even if they weren't qualified. He exercised the veto more times than the 6 men before him combined. Notice he had 12 vetoes. So that was more than Washington through Monroe. And then when it came to, if you don't know this, Jackson was the president who had the Indian Removal Act passed and forced the Indians from the southeast part of the United States on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. In doing that, he ignored the Supreme Court. So he really, and that's not all, Job and Hannah. You want to look up some other things, but these are some of the key things that he did to expand the presidency. Now, after he was out, for the next almost 100 years, up until FDR, call this period Congress Strikes Back. If we want to stick with the Star Wars metaphors, we could say Andrew Jackson was a new hope, although he wasn't really a hope. And then Congress Strikes Back.
Revenge of the Congress.
Revenge of the Congress. There you go. I was thinking the original trilogy, which is the best, of course. But I have not seen the 9th one, and I refuse to see The Rise of Skywalker because the new ones are trash.
I
But,
refuse to see it too. I still haven't seen it.
I went and saw The Force Awakens because my son wanted to see it. And I was like, nope, no more. Now I did like,
Personally, I didn't think The Force Awakens was awful. I didn't think it was awful.
when Luke Skywalker drank milk out of that yak looking creature, I was like, okay, that's it for me. But I did like Rogue One.
Rogue
Oh,
One.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
Rogue
like
One was
that
good.
one. That one was good.
I did like Solo. And
Solo made me sad.
my son says Mandalorian is the best thing that's happened since the original. So I need to start
Oh,
watching.
Mandalorian was so garbage.
I didn't like The Mandalorian.
Mandalorian
at
was so
all.
bad.
I didn't even finish all of it.
I couldn't get through it. Skywalker has been good.
Is
I
that
like
a good show?
Yeah.
Is that the one that's got the actors from the second series
I'm not sure.
played Obi-Wan and Anakin?
I think so.
Okay, we're getting sidetracked. But we're going to stick with Congress Strikes Back. Remember, Congress originally was to be the kind of the power broker of the three branches, and Jackson kind of made it to where the power tipped in the favor of the presidency. Well, Congress kind of got that power back in their court, although there were some presidents that exercised some higher levels of presidential power, including Lincoln during the Civil War, Teddy Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson. Usually these presidents that kind of flashed up during this time had to do so because of a crisis. And there's no bigger crisis than the Civil War for Lincoln. You know, if you think about poor Lincoln, I used to really feel bad for George W. Bush, little George, because it was only 8 months after he became president that 9/11 happened. And so he had to deal with 9/11 in responding to the Taliban for all the remaining 7 years of his presidency. But Lincoln became president, and there had already been, I think by the time he became president, all 7 states of the South, or 7 states had seceded, and eventually 11 would be seceded. He dealt with the Civil War his whole presidency. So I felt more sorry for him. But he dealt with it with strong leadership. With Franklin Roosevelt, we have the emergence of the presidency as a very, very strong branch of government, in the fact that maybe just as strong, or maybe now the new power broker above Congress. What was the crisis that propelled Franklin Roosevelt to be such a strong executive? Think 1928 to 1932. Strong, major crisis. Kaylee's thinking hard about it.
Got to be some sort of war.
Not a war.
Dang it. Was it some sort of terrorist attack?
Nope, it was a really big
Didn't he
financial.
get put in a wheelchair? What?
FDR wasn't a wheelchair, but
When the stock
Um,
market crashed?
huh?
And the stock market crashed.
Stock market did crash, which led to the Great Depression. And it was also happening during the Dust Bowl. So, and President Hoover chose not to really deal with it on a federal level. He wanted the states to deal with it. So that's when FDR came in. Those of you who have FDR, I'm thinking that's one of the Muldrow groups. FDR came in with all of his programs, his New Deal, to get Americans back to work, to get the economy jump-started. And so this is when the power of the presidency really started to rise, the rise of the executive branch. I'll use rise, even though I haven't seen Rise of Skywalker. Because I'm an open-minded guy. Just the way I am. But Roosevelt served on into World War I. So in a way, Lacey, a war is included there. And then Truman had to continue on through the war. And when World War II ended, was that the end of war? Well, it was the end of combat for a time, but we ended into a Cold War, right, with Russia. But then it didn't take long till there was another conflict, the Korean conflict from 50 to 53, and then the Vietnam conflict from about 60, officially around 62 to 75. And so the presidency became strong during these times, including Eisenhower, which one of you has, on up into Reagan. Reagan, the great communicator who, by his leadership, not just him, but a big part of him, saw the end of the Cold War with the destruction of the Berlin Wall in 1989, when your professor was a young, fresh-faced 18-year-old college student. Similar to like one of you is. All right, but now Camden's 17, so he's closer. So there you see the Cold War. In the 70s, Congress tried to reassert itself. But why has presidential power grown? Because the Constitution hasn't changed except for amendments. In one amendment in particular, saying presidents can only serve 2 terms. So what has changed? Well, we're going to talk about how the office has grown and become more unified. A lot of the presidents exhibited their strong personalities,
I guess
like our
you
man
could say,
Teddy Roosevelt.
I guess you could say a new power has entered.
Okay.
New power.
Uh,
A new hope. Do you get it?
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
that was so funny.
How about maybe the presidency awakens?
That's a little better.
But good
Turn
thing,
of the presidency.
did you know that when the original movie came out in 77, it was just called Star Wars? It wasn't called The New Hope.
Yeah.
It wasn't called The New Hope until kind of when the second trilogy came out. Y'all are getting all kinds of good Star Wars trivia. Now, are you fans of a movie series that I am even more of a fan of Star Wars, and that's Indiana Jones?
I'm not.
I like Indiana Jones.
Hannah does.
So you know Indiana Jones is played by Harrison Ford, AKA Han Solo. Well, George Lucas, who wrote Star Wars, also wrote Indiana Jones, and he got Steven Spielberg to direct it. And originally, Tom Selleck was supposed to be Indiana Jones. Tom Selleck is an actor who you probably just know him from geriatric commercials, but he used to play a detective named Magnum PI. But anyway, CBS would not let Tom Selleck out of his contract with Magnum PI to play Indiana Jones. So George Lucas says to Spielberg, hey, I've got this great actor who played Han Solo who could be Indiana Jones. And the rest is history, because I could not imagine anybody else as Indiana Jones besides Harrison Ford.
I couldn't imagine anyone else as Han Solo.
That too.
Han Solo is my favorite character on Star Wars.
Han is the man.
Yep.
And Chewie, what a great sidekick. Okay, another reason presidential power has grown is because our government and our society has become more complex, right? We've got problems today and issues that presidents 200 years ago, 150 years ago, never would have thought of. Another reason is because Congress has delegated more authority to the presidency. Mass media is another reason. And then because the United States, from the time we started, we were kind of like a little brother on the world scene, right? England was greater, France was greater. There would have been some other nations that would have been considered the superpowers of the day. Well, probably beginning in the late 19th century into the 20th century, we became not just a superpower, but the superpower. And so we need a strong presidency. We need a strong president to exude strength to the world. Some other factors are the expansion of war powers, globalization of our world, right? Our world is more connected. And so with the organizations like NATO and the European Union, the League of Nations, all of these alliances and things that have connected us to the world on a greater level. But that just didn't lead to our leadership getting stronger. We look at things that are happening today, like Russia invading Ukraine. We see that Putin, the leader of Russia, has a strong influence. So globalization has really kind of brought out leaders who would be strong, dominant personalities in other countries as well. All right, we're going to move to the last section of this chapter. Try to get through it very quickly. This is the presidency as an institution, or the institutional presidency. Because really the executive branch is not just one person, is it? The president. It's really an institution. And even when we began with George Washington, it was, institution wouldn't be the right word, but it wasn't just one person. It just wasn't the office of the president. It was an executive branch that had a president, right, a vice president, and then Washington appointed 3 or 4 secretaries. Like Jefferson was his Secretary of State. And Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury. So the presidency has never been just about one individual. It was a branch that had a small group to now truly it's an institution with thousands of people involved. So we're in the textbook here, and I want you to see this good little, you're going to see this on the test, this figure. It'll be a fill-in type of question, but this is a good visual of the institution of the presidency. Revolving around the man, and one day maybe we'll be able to say the woman, right? Or we'll be able to say, I guess we'll say the person of the president. Revolving around that person are these 4 groups or bodies that make up collectively the whole institution of the presidency. You have the White House staff, you have the cabinet, you have the EOP, the Executive Office of the President, and you have the independent agencies and government corporations. Now, make sure you read this section, especially. Of course, you need to be reading the textbook, all the chapter, but especially this, because I'm not going to go over it in great detail here. But when we talk about the cabinet, we're talking about the group that Washington began with. Washington had a Secretary of State. You can see here, there's a Department of State. He had a Secretary of Finance, or the Secretary of the Treasury. There's still a Department of the Treasury. And I think his third one was a Secretary of Defense. So that's what Washington began with. Washington had a cabinet. And since then, these 3 other groups have been added. Now, in the cabinet, there's 15 government departments, like the Department of Education, the Department of Defense, and each department is led by a secretary. The Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Education. These 15 secretaries make up the cabinet. And then, of course, underneath them, you have thousands of people. Like, for example, the Department of Defense oversees 700,000 civilian employees and over 1 million military personnel. The Department of Education employs 4,200 people. So these 15 secretaries are over departments that have a lot of people, a lot of civilian workers working for them. So it's a pretty important group around the president, the cabinet. The White House staff is going to include those that work closest with the president. You have the person who is the chief of staff, the person who kind of oversees the whole White House staff. You have a press secretary. This is the person who speaks on behalf of the president to the media on a daily basis. Joe Biden, I don't remember her name, but Joe Biden presently has an African-American woman as his press secretary. Then he has senior advisors and special assistants. When Trump was president, some of his advisors included his family, right? Ivanka, her husband Jared, his son Don Jr. So those are the people that are closest to the president and see him probably on a daily basis. Whereas the cabinet leaders would not see him on a daily basis. The executive office of the vice president was created in 1939 when FDR was president. These are around 2,000 highly specialized people who work for all the agencies in this executive office of the president. See. So, for example, the most important and largest EOP agency is the Office of Management and Budget. So you're going to have highly specialized people like accountants and financial advisors on this, in this agency. There's the Council of Economic Advisors. This group constantly analyzes the economy and tries to find trends. You know, is the economy going to fluctuate or drop? These are people who are highly specialized, who have studied like depressions in the past, the Great Depression, recessions. They study the trends of the stock market. Another important office in this agency is the National Security Council. They are made up of individuals who give advice on national security. So the executive office of the president, highly specialized or what we might say elite people in their areas. The vice presidency was not up here in this chart of 4, but I would include the vice presidency. I would include them in the White House staff personally, even though the vice presidency only has 2.
Mr. Binks,
Yo,
it's 11:45.
thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
The vice presidency only has 2 purposes: to succeed the president in case of death or resignation or incapacity, and to preside over the Senate. But the vice president could be an advisor that the president depends upon. And you would hope so. You would hope that the vice president and the president have a relationship of trust. But that's not always been the case. It's been said that when Kennedy became president, he made Lyndon Johnson his vice president, so Lyndon Johnson would essentially be ineffective and would not give Kennedy any problems, because Johnson was one of the most powerful senators, and Kennedy didn't want to have to deal with him. And then you have independent agencies and government corporations like the CIA, the Environmental Protection Agency, NASA. These are independent agencies and government corporations that work with the executive branch. The first spouse can be the first spouse can be either a hindrance or a help to the president. A lot of times the first spouse will kind of pursue what they have a heart for. So not Barbara Bush, but Little George's wife, I can't remember her name. Barbara was the first Bush's wife. But Little George's wife, she had a heart for education. I think so did Obama's wife, Michelle, and she had a big impact on school lunches. So anyway, that was kind of a speed through of the last part of the chapter. Again, know that figure about the 4 things that make up the institutional presidency. Do you have any questions? All right, until Friday, may the force be with you.